The next project we'll be doing in Illustrator involves making use of a very specific feature of the program, namely the grid. Not that annoying perspective grid that seems to pop up at random every now and then. If you haven't seen it yet, you might someday. But no, this grid creates a series of squares along our artboard, and that allows us to line objects up perfectly. It allows us to perfectly space things out. So that's a pretty good feature of the program, and that's why we are going to be doing this project to utilize that feature. And it'll also help us learn a couple of other things as well. First off, what is pixel art? Pixel art is a representation of how old characters, particularly in video games, used to be drawn. See, back in the day, you used to only be able to see only a few hundred pixels on a screen, or give or take. And you could see the individual squares right on the screen. Well, pixel art is kind of an imitation of that. You see, what you're seeing here are not actually pixels, but just individual squares. Some are big, some are really small. But utilizing Illustrator's grid, that allows us to create a perfect replication of the kinds of pixel art you see here. So we're going to find a character or some kind of drawing to replicate, and our drawings are going to be made entirely of squares. Now, I ask that the drawings you choose have a fair amount of detail, and I'll show you examples of ones that may not have a fair amount of detail in class. But any of these will do, although I wouldn't choose anything too complex. I think this is a pretty good one to do. Good old Mega Man. So I'm going to copy this image. If you haven't played any of his games, you should. And now I am going to start a new file. This is also a good opportunity for me to go over some specifics on starting a new file. So I'm going to go up to File and New. And with every project we do in Illustrator, we want to make sure the units are set to pixels. I've said this to a lot of people already, but make sure we do that. We don't want to set it to inches, not points. Look closely to make sure it's not set to points to begin with, because sometimes it is. As soon as you set it to pixels, or after the first time you do it, it should remember that you did it from there on out. So just make sure. The reason why we don't want to do like inches, for example, is because the computers here have a tough time creating images that big. We just want to measure by pixels. And I'll often give you numbers to put in. 1920 by 1080 is the typical resolution of a computer screen. So that means that the artboard will be just as wide and just as high, or just as tall, as a computer screen would. At least the same ratio, I should say, because we're zoomed out slightly, because we kind of have to be in order for us to see all of it, or in order for us to see anything but the artboard. But it's the same proportions, I guess you could say. Anyway, pixels. Make sure the width and height match up with the directions. And click OK. That gives us our artboard. So we're going to go ahead and just paste in that picture. Grab the selection tool to drag it around. And I'll leave it sized as it is so far. I'm going to go up to View, and I'm going to show this grid. So I'm going to click the Show Grid option, and I'm also going to go back up here and make sure this option is enabled, Snap to Grid. So what does that do? Let me just zoom in a little bit, and I shall show you. Of course, I'll show you in class too, but Snap to Grid makes sure whatever object you're working with lines up with the squares in the grid. So like if I draw this rectangle, notice how it's instantly snapping in place. It's locking in place. Whereas if I had that option off, I have more precise control over how large the square is, that's true, but it's more difficult for me to line it up. So using the grid helps you line objects up and gets them to be exactly where you want them to be. So whether or not you use the grid kind of depends on the kind of project you're doing. Obviously for this one we are using it because we want our squares or rectangles that we're drawing to line up. However, if you want more precise control, then you might not want to use at least the snap to grid option. You might not want to use this option, but for this project it is perfectly suitable. This project will allow us to make use of a nifty feature in Illustrator called the eyedropper. And it's actually a tool, and that tool allows us to copy any color we see here on the screen and apply it to anything we want. In this instance, we're going to apply it to our shapes, or our rectangles. Even though this looks like a square and these are all very square-like, the official name is rectangle, so I'm just going to use that word most often. So anyway, what I'm going to do is make sure I'm working with the fill for good measure. And I have this square selected, rectangle, whichever you choose, and I'm going to click on the eyedropper tool, and that's where it's located, eyedropper. And if I click a blue, then it applies the blue as the fill. I could do this, I could do that. Anywhere I click on the screen, that's what color it applies as the fill. So that's pretty handy. And that's how we're going to replicate the pixel art that we choose. Okay, so obviously this isn't really replicating what we see here right now, so let me just do a little bit of this. You can choose to do this in multiple ways. You can place, to the best of your ability, the rectangles on top of the pixel art. I don't recommend this way though, because the snap to grid feature is on, you won't be able to get your rectangles to be perfectly sized unless you mess around with the size of the picture. So, I don't know. You can do that if you really want to, but I just recommend recreating it off to the side. Keep in mind, you may not recreate it like square for square. So for example, this might only go 5 squares out. Here I went 4, 5, 6. That's fine, as long as when you're done, the picture has a close resemblance to the original. Now you notice that these squares are the wrong color, but that's okay. They're all black, so what I can do is I can either click and drag to highlight all of them, or I could click one, then hold down Shift and click all of the others. Then go to the eyedropper and then choose black. And it looks like I missed one. Then I could do this. So let me just do this for a second. I'm going to draw it over here at first. Okay. I didn't have to do that, but I did. Okay, well I know this is going to be the same number of squares, so I could just copy and paste the same one. So feel free to copy and paste whenever necessary. Here's a little trick that should help things go a little more quickly. I drew 2 separate rectangles and then changed the colors of them to that color. But what I could also do is this. I could draw one large rectangle, but it's covering up those 2 black ones. Well, you may recall in Publisher that there was a feature that allowed us to send objects forward and backward. Well, that same feature exists here. If we right-click anything that we draw and go down to Arrange, we have those same options. Send backward, send to back. I'm just going to click Send to back because I don't want to have to click it multiple times. You might have to click Send backward multiple times. And look at that, I get the same result. I just sent it in back of everything else. So that is a handy feature. Okay, so I'll just draw a little bit more of this. I won't take up too much of your time. Now, you notice that I have to click back and forth between tools a lot. What you could do is make a note of the letter that's written right beside the name of the tool. In this case, it's I, and the selection tool is V, and the rectangle tool is M for some reason. I'm not going to ask you to memorize those letters. However, it might be a good idea when you're working on a particular project to memorize the letters that correspond to the tools you're using most often. So for this project, I know I'm going to be using the eyedropper and rectangle tools a lot. So if you remember M and I, just those 2 letters, while you're doing this project, that could save a lot of mouse clicks. It might just be easier to just press those letters rather than having to just go back and click these shapes every time. But it's up to you. So I'm going to press I for eyedropper, even though eyedropper begins with E. Yeah, and you know what? I might as well remember V too for selection tool. Okay, so I for eyedropper, click blue, M for rectangle, and I'll draw some more. It's up to you whether you want to set the colors first or wait until after you draw them. That's all down to your preference. I think this needs to be moved over a little bit. Oops. Okay. I'll just shrink this. And because I have the snap to grid option enabled, when I just drag it a little bit to the right, it shrinks by precisely 1 square. So anyway, for like the eye of the robot, I can just go out this far. It actually goes out that far. I pressed V to go to the selection tool. Sometimes you can just use your best estimate as to how big certain things will be. And I keep going over here to click the shapes, even though I don't really need to, because I have the keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so the eye is right here, even though a robot really shouldn't have human-like eyes, but that's okay. And he has skin too, apparently. And I'm going to draw this skin-colored rectangle. It looks like it's taking up more space than it should, but keep in mind, I'm going to send it to the back and then draw other things on top of it. And I can always resize it if I need to. See, like, I feel like this should be bigger. The white part should also be bigger. I feel like this whole thing should be bigger, actually. But you know what? It doesn't really have to be. Because remember, we're going for a resemblance to the original, not a 100% replica. So that's fine. Like, I might make this blue part a little bit thicker than it is right here. Try not to get things too divergent from how they're supposed to be. If I use that word correctly. I can just copy and paste this and change the color. Whoops. Change the color to blue. And I don't think I really have to do any more because we can start to see it take shape here. So this is clearly this part of the head. And we can just work our way down. In fact, you might prefer to do the outline first. Like, you might just want to do the black outline if there is a black outline. And that might be easier for some people. Okay, see, this corresponds to right here. And then you can just kind of go up to form this arm or hand, whatever it is. And then do this. And then fill in the color as you go. And you might have to readjust a few things. So use the selection tool to readjust the size. I do think I would need to move this stuff out. There should be a little bit more. Oops. Should be a little bit more here of the, I guess you could call it the skin, if you want to refer to it as that. Yeah, and then there should be a little bit more white. I just copied and pasted. I feel like this video is going on a little bit long, so I think I'm going to end it very soon. You can also copy colors that you made yourself. So anyway, once we accomplish that, yeah, there's supposed to be some blue in here in between. So I'd have to move this out even further. But that's fine. Once we accomplish that, we have a pretty decent pixel art representation, or a decent pixel art recreation. Yeah, so we can see that this should be smaller. So I got a little carried away with just estimating. But that's okay, because we sometimes do have to estimate. Okay, so anyway, what's this project about? This project is about utilizing Illustrator's grid. We can show it here, make sure the snap to grid option is enabled, and we use a combination of the rectangle and selection and eyedropper tools to copy the colors from the original and into our own project. So we'll have to use the selection tool probably to relocate or resize a few things. Also useful for copying and pasting. So yeah, this project will add up to our pixel art recreation.